June the 20th, 2014, and I'm interviewing Stan Newens, former MP for Harlow and Euro MP. Okay, Stan, just wonder if I could ask you, first of all, do you think that when Margaret Thatcher came to power, do you think the Tory party had a project, in order to defeat the organised working class?
I think that when Margaret Thatcher came to power, she herself and some of her friends wished to destroy trade union power. I'm not saying that that was true of all Conservatives, because there were still One Nation Conservatives dating back to the sort of approach that Macmillan had, who was critical of Margaret Thatcher, for example, on privatisation. But I think that Margaret Thatcher certainly wished to inflict a major defeat on trade unions.
Okay, and do you think did that aim, did that extend across? Do you think the capitalist class as a whole? Do you think, or was Margaret Thatcher and her group, were they acting independently? Do you think?
I don't think it extended across all employers or people like that sort. But undoubtedly there was a group which very strongly supported Margaret Thatcher's approach on this issue.
Okay. So what about when the strike began? What was your attitude towards it? What did you think when it began then?
Well, I was absolutely 100% behind the strike. I thought that the miners had got to stand up against the enforced closure of mines. When McGregor was in charge as well, it was quite clear from what he'd already done in the steel industry that he wasn't sympathetic to the miners' case. And I thought it was vital that the miners should in fact take action to defend their industry.
Okay, and you were a miner yourself in your youth as well?
I worked in the mines on the coalface from roughly 1952 to the end of 1955, and I therefore had a particular experience of mining, although many of the methods which I'd become accustomed to had in fact been superseded by 1984.
Right. Okay. Did you still have any contact with miners that you'd worked with?
Not much. Not much.
No. Okay.
Only with the odd person.
Yeah. Okay. In the strike, a lot of people were quite shocked about the behaviour of the police in the strike and the behaviour of the judiciary, and for a lot of people, it made clear perhaps the idea that there was a relationship between the Tory party, the police, the judiciary, and the capitalist class as a whole. And what do you think about that? What was going on there?
I think that Margaret Thatcher had discussions with the police to take a very, very hard line against the strikers, and it's quite clear that they did. The Orgreave business was a disgrace because even the BBC, it showed the miners throwing stones at the police, which was achieved by turning the film round. Actually, the miners were attacked by the police. They then subsequently arrested nearly 100 miners, and afterwards even the courts had to drop the charges because it was quite clear that the evidence against many of the miners had been fabricated and copied.
Some people say that was a moment when the police kind of became above the law, and then that had a knock-on effect on the way that they acted at Hillsborough, and the Hillsborough tragedy.
Well, I think that the South Yorkshire police had a particularly bad name. I'm not going to condemn all the police forces, because I think in Nottingham some police were sympathetic, and during the course of the strike I went to the police in London because certain members of the force on the beat were harassing people correcting, and it was quite clear to me that the police officials with whom I discussed this matter were sympathetic to the miners and were embarrassed by the way in which some of their officers were behaving on the street, and promised me they would do what they could to try to keep things within bounds.
Okay. You became Euro MP just before the strike, just at the start of the
Yes.
of the strike, and London, I think, was one of the main centres of support for the strike. Did that express itself through the Labour Party in London, where you were Euro
Well,
MP?
certainly my Labour Party, which then was the London Central Labour Party, was very concerned to support the strike. And there were lots of people going out on the streets and collecting money and working in those respects. And as far as I was concerned, I spoke at one meeting at County Hall with Tony Benn and the Miners' Deputy Secretary, and I think I spoke at another meeting with Ken Livingstone. And certainly we were involved in London in giving what support we could to the miners. I was a Labour and Cooperative member and had very close connections with London cooperators, and the London Political Committee, led at that time by Jim Lascelles, did a great deal to try to supply food and help, particularly to the Kent miners. And the miners afterwards gave him an inscribed lamp to recognise the important part that he played in giving them support.
Okay. Do you think were there any tensions within the Labour Party? Do you think about the strike? Did it express itself, through divisions within the party itself, like maybe perhaps between the leadership and the rank and file?
Well, I think it's quite clear that Neil Kinnock was quite unhappy about the tactics which were pursued in some respect by Arthur Scargill, and there were feelings which in some ways were reflected in that way, but generally speaking, the Labour Party as a whole in principle was in favour of the strike, although of course they were not in favour of violence or any tactics which were likely to flagrantly break the law.
Okay. I know in Harlow as well there was a very impressive organisation, and I think people have been saying that about £1,000 was raised every week in Harlow, and that was primarily organised by Labour Party members as well. It seemed as though that the Labour Party itself was very much the backbone of supporting the miners. Is that true, do you think?
The Labour Party did give very good support, particularly Judy Chan was involved in helping to organise that. As I was a member of the European Parliament and spent much of the week away, and also when I was back in Britain, I was in London,
Yes.
I didn't play a big part locally,
Yes.
but nonetheless, in all respects, I and my family were wholeheartedly behind the campaign, which was organised in Harlow and in London and in Europe, and for that matter anywhere else.
Okay. One of the major aspects, or one of the most significant perhaps aspects of the strike was the development of women's support groups, miners' wives support groups. Was that something new, do you think, in a strike, and what was the significance of that?
I don't think that there were any previous strikes in which the wives and families of strikers had taken as an active part. I think that it was very important, and I think it reflected the fact that the whole of the community within the mining area was wholeheartedly behind the struggle to try to save the industry.
Okay. In your book, you're a little bit critical of some of the tactics of the strike leaders. I don't know if that's fair to say. What criticisms did you have of the way the strike developed?
I thought that Arthur Scargill, who was immensely brave, totally committed, a very, very fine orator, had many qualities. But I think that he should have had a ballot, particularly with Nottingham, and I think that they missed the opportunity of drawing in the union representing the deputies and overmen, which could have been done, more approach. And I think when it was clear that they weren't winning, I think that an effort should have been made by Arthur Scargill to make use of people like Stan Orme and Len Murray and others who were seeking to get some sort of compromise. And I feel that in this respect, much as I supported the struggle, that the tactics were not as I would have wished.
Okay. Did you have any sympathy with the view you were saying a little while ago about Eric Heffer's point of view that Arthur Scargill had no choice, that the Tory party were out to break the power of the miners?
Well, I thought that the Tory party, or rather Margaret Thatcher and her particular circle, were out to break the power of the miners, and I was absolutely behind the miners, and I think that Arthur Scargill was absolutely right to fight. But I think that in any battle, if you see that things are going against you, your object should be to save what you can. And it may not be the best in those circumstances not to modify your position. And in my opinion, I think that something could have been done by using people who were available to try to get some sort of compromise. And for example, Willie Whitelaw, the Tory deputy, clearly was approachable, and certain approaches were made. But Arthur was absolutely adamant that they wouldn't make any deal which didn't involve a complete capitulation by the management on closures. And I think that was no longer realistic.
Okay. Just going back to Harlow again. I know you said you were in London and in Europe for a lot of the time, but in Harlow, talking to people who are involved in the group locally, that seemed to have been like a huge effort to support the strike locally, as I say, with town centre collections, door-to-door collections, workplace collections, bringing groups of miners into the town to raise support, and taking food parcels and gifts to Nottinghamshire. Was that your perception at the time? Did it feel like the town itself was behind the miners, or would you say?
It was, at the time, I was very conscious of the fact that the labour movement locally was 100% behind the miners. One shouldn't, however, disregard the fact that that doesn't mean the whole of the population here was behind the miners. And one of the reasons why the miners didn't win was, for example, because non-unionised lorry drivers, in many cases, refused to support the strike. On the whole, the railwaymen did. But frankly, I remember discussing with Ron Todd the situation, and he was doing what he could, but we recognised that some of the drivers were not prepared to stand out. Just, of course, as in Nottingham, you had a lot of the miners who were not prepared to support the strike and were used. Incidentally, one of the people who gave advice to the opponents of the strike was Lord Falconer, who afterwards was Blair's left hand, one of his ministers. And I thought that was appalling. As far as we were concerned in the European Parliament, we had collections within the Parliament and made a lot of noise within the Parliament to try to bring home the importance of the strike. And we put down a motion, although unfortunately on one occasion, reflecting the fact that not everybody was with us, we lost the vote.
Okay. All right. Raphael Samuel, he says that the support groups, like the group in Harlow, owed more to a humanitarian spirit of good works than, in any classical trade union sense, solidarity. That seems quite a harsh judgment. I wonder what you think about that.
No, I think that there was a lot of solidarity, traditional trade union solidarity. But I think that it's true that there was a lot of humanitarian feeling about this, and that was reflected in the fact that whole families, including the women, supported the men because they felt that their whole way of life was at stake, as it was, because subsequently when pits were closed in many of these pit villages, there was no work and there was a great deal of hardship, and many of the young people who would have gone to work and accustomed themselves to a working life, in fact subsequently got into trouble.
Okay. All right. I wonder if you could try and just place the strike in history now. What do you think the long-term significance of the strike has been?
Well, the strike itself was a cardinal defeat for the labour movement. There's no question about that. And as such, it undoubtedly had a very, very bad effect on the whole of the labour movement. And in my opinion, was reflected in the fact that Labour itself had lost support in the country, and that the Conservative Party managed to carry on in office.
Okay. So do you think more could have been done to help the strike to win? Do you think it would have been was it possible for the strike to win, do you think?
I think the strike could have been won if the drivers of the lorries had been prepared to back it, and also if the Nottingham miners and the overmen and deputies had been won over to support the strike. I think the strike, in many ways, it was not ignominiously defeated or anything of the sort, but it couldn't quite muster the strength that was required. If that strength could have been added to by more people coming in, I think we should have won, and I think that it would have had a tremendously important effect on giving strength to the labour movement, not only industrially but also politically.
Do you think has it had an effect on the way the Labour Party developed after the strike? Do you think the defeat?
I think that to some extent that it did. I think that the ideas that Tony Blair represented of abandoning some of the fighting ideas of the Labour Party and trying to turn the party into a middle-of-the-road organisation like the American Democrats. I think that was made easier as a result of the defeat in the strike.
Okay. And what about some people say that things like the unleashing of the free market and the massive rise in inequality, they're connected to the fact that the power of the miners were broken and that trade unionism was set back massively. Do you think there's a link there?
I think there is. I mean, quite clearly, trade unions today are not as powerful as they were. But there's also the point that the industry in this country has changed, and you no longer have the large labour-intensive industries which existed in the past, which inevitably has brought about a diminution in the number of manual trade unionists. And that itself is a separate development which would have taken place anyway, you see.
Okay. Do you think then that kind of working class, I guess it follows on a little bit from your last point, do you think the level of working class organisation and solidarity that was kind of manifested in the strike, do you think, can that return, do you think, or do you think, that's gone, that kind of idea?
I think that there's no possibility that there'll ever be as many people employed in mining as there were, and I think that you will not get the large-scale manual trade unions that you had. But I still believe that the time will come when working class people will in fact feel that they need a completely different system, and that this change will be brought about. I mean, if you go back to the 1930s, despite the defeat in the general strike and the catastrophic election defeat of Labour in 1931, Labour took a long time to recover, and had there been an election in 1940, which there was not because of the war, there would have been a Conservative government returned to power again. But in 1945, conditions were such that there was massive growth of support for Labour, which brought in a Labour government with a huge majority. And I think that that will come about again, possibly not in my time.
Okay. So what do you see as the future then for socialist politics? Do you still see that, is there do you see that the future being the Labour Party having a close relationship with the trade unions, or do you see there being an increasing separation between the Labour Party and the trade unions?
I think that you cannot have an effective Labour and socialist policy without the support of the organised working class. And I think that that is very important. At the present time, I think it's been made manifestly clear that the only party which is likely to gain strength in the face of a general election and have a chance of forming a government is the Labour Party. And as long as that remains the case, I believe all socialists should be working for a Labour Party victory. But unless the Labour Party delivers in the future, eventually there will be a change and there will be other parties and the growth. I personally hope that the Labour Party is going to be increasingly restored to socialist aims by its membership, and it won't go down. But if the Labour Party lost several elections, and after the recent changes in its relationship with the trade unions and was continuing, I think that it's quite possible that there would be considerable breakaways, and that would lead to disunity and problems longer. But in the long run, I believe myself that the capitalist system, which naturally results in a great deal of the wealth eventually going into the hands of a small minority, will not survive. And we will have to have, not merely in Britain, but worldwide, a system which distributes more of the world's wealth to the population as a whole. and I believe that that will eventually come about, because if it doesn't, then frankly the only alternative to that is war and strife.
Okay. Do you think will that change come about through? Do you think through parliamentary politics, through electoral politics?
I think that parliamentary politics will play their part, but parliamentary politics never has been the total side of politics, and there must be a movement outside of Parliament to support that and make demands. And if one is thinking that socialist change can just be achieved by a group of people in the House of Commons changing the law, that would be, in my opinion, unrealistic. There, I've always believed, and I certainly believe now, that we have to organise a large section of the population, but at the present time, that's not being done.
No. Okay. Perhaps just one last question on the coal industry. Really, some people say that coal has got a future, and that a policy of reopening mines, should be pursued. What do you think about that?
I think that it's appalling that the industry was shut down, and we continue to import 50 million tonnes of coal a year, which is adding to our balance of payments deficit, which cannot go on indefinitely without standards of living in this country for a large section of the population being very considerably reduced, and that is happening at the present stage. I think that some of the mines, there is plenty of coal still in Britain, and I think some of the mines could be reopened and others could be developed. But of course, in the long run, frankly, we've got to try to develop our energies from other sources, because it's quite clear, although we were ahead in the clean coal process, it's quite clear that fossil fuels have a very, very bad effect on the environment.
I think that was part of the original programme, wasn't it, of the miners at the time, to have an integrated policy of ways.
We had a clean coal policy.
Yeah.
We were the most advanced, and Mrs. Thatcher shut it down.
Yeah. So in another respect, perhaps if the miners' own policy had been pursued, we'd be in a better place now than we are.
Oh, I think that's undoubtedly true.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Stan.
Okay.
Thank you.